One of the more infuriatingly dumb things believers say is that God is outside of space and somehow time, or outside of space-time if you want to talk about the qualities of the natural world more accurately. But if one does want to tease apart space and time, since that's how the average uneducated American thinks about it, I could see how a God could be outside of space, but time, not so much. And while we don't know who first came up with this centuries-old idea, who, by the way, didn't have the scientific tools to investigate such an assertion, we do know it was St. Augustine who was among the first people to develop this idea in his works, The City of God and Confessions, who surmised it was God that created time, so God is not contained in or limited to time, which is an assertion that, even if true, raises more questions. It was St. Augustine that developed the idea that God sees all of our time at once, which I'll get back to later. Anyway, what with God creating time but somehow not experiencing time to do that, it's really St. Augustine who we have to blame for the special pleading fallacy, where the rules of the game somehow don't apply to the game maker. Imagine having to play Monopoly with the creator of Monopoly who says the rules of the game don't apply to them. Yeah, that'd be a good time, obviously. Welcome to another episode of Noah's Snark. I'm your host, Atheist Joseph Vina. So there's two things we need to explore here when a believer says God is outside of time. Do they mean God experiences time differently than we do, or do they mean God is atemporal? The first problem is that regardless of their answer, they can't explain how they know this as a justified true belief. What qualifies as a justified true belief? For a person to hold a justified true belief, three conditions must happen at the same time. One accepts the claim as true, the claim must be factually correct and match reality, and one must have good logical evidence or reasoning for their belief. Now, it could be there is a God and they do experience time differently, or time differently in another space. I could see that, but they'd still be an entity that experiences time. Time still occurs, thus God is not outside of time. Now, if a believer wants to say God is atemporal, that is, not experiencing time, they have to account for how a being that doesn't experience time does anything. How does that entity take action, since actions require time? God could not have created time without time, since creation is an action and actions require time to occur. Now, before dissecting a God outside of time any further, I do want to say that if God exists, I don't see any contradiction between God's presence outside of our space and time and God's omniscience, largely depending on how I like to define omniscience. I could see a God outside of time, but experiencing some other sort of time, faster or slower perhaps, and still knowing everything that's going on within the time we experience, as if God were able to look at our entire universe's space-time as something like maybe a hologram or a slice of time within the block universe hypothesis of time, in which time, from our perspective, doesn't actually exist. However, this does raise the logical problem of foreknowledge and free will. If God exists outside of time, or even if God exists simultaneously experiencing our time, and he knows everything that will happen, it raises questions about free will. If the future is already known and fixed, then human choices are predetermined, challenging the concept of free agency. Of course, the free will defense here will be, but God doesn't force you to choose your actions. But this defense unsurprisingly misses the issue that the consequences of actions and decisions, from our perspective, are not static events, as they play roles in future action-taking and decision-making. Put another way, the outcome of actions or decisions lead to future actions or decisions. That's a really important point. Believers tend to believe that actions and consequences are mutually exclusive, static events that have no bearing on future outcomes and aren't part of an ongoing narrative. Sorry, but that's simply not how life in the space-time we experience works. Now comes the improbability of relationships or interactions with this God. If God is outside of time, how can he have a relationship with humans who are within time? How would he be able to respond or interact in real time, especially if one characterizes God as unchanging, as believers often do? This brings up a whole side issue of how God is unchanging. Does one mean just morally or in his very nature? But then God wouldn't be capable of actions if his nature could not change, etc. But I digress. A God outside of time kind of makes any form of prayer or communication nonsensical. Here I am praying to a God to change something, if that's what I'm praying about, to a God that is unchanging? That's nonsensical, whether from the stance that God never changes his mind, or if God doesn't experience time, or if God experiences time differently. So an apologist is going to have their work cut out for them here as to how God communicates, receives, or answers prayer requests based on how he experiences time, especially since anything they say is going to be pure speculation. By the way, can you imagine God saying, "Oh, shucks, Billy, sorry I didn't cure your cancer in time, but my time is different, and I didn't get around to it before you died. I'll compensate you in heaven. Trust me, bro." I suspect the explanation behind the mechanisms of prayer requests would amount to nothing more than magic. Not that magic is anything to sneeze at, right? Now, since I brought up God as an unchanging being, I might as well ruminate on the implications of God's static existence. Let's expand on this a little more. Saying God is outside of time suggests a being we as temporal entities cannot have a relationship with, since relationships require time to occur. Again, if God has a static existence, he can't be involved in creation and change unless you take God's unchangingness to be in relationship to maybe something like his moral character only. Obviously, believers don't think about God this way because a God that doesn't experience time would be pointless. So God has to experience time somehow. But this raises the question, a lot of raising of questions here, of how God can exist infinitely into the past, in the same way believers question something like the universe existing infinitely into the past, without postulating the possibility that maybe time flowed differently in the universe once upon a time. Yes, we know, they'll just invoke special pleading. God is always the exception somehow. The idea of a being outside of time is problematic because it's clearly a human attempt to conceptualize or describe something allegedly beyond human understanding. So it becomes not only paradoxical, but more importantly, not remotely supported by any evidence. Has anyone ever seen or measured outside of space-time? I mean, maybe it can be done, and maybe we haven't built the tools to detect that yet, but until then, maybe it's wisest to admit it's all speculation at best, though I'm willing to hear evidence to the contrary. Oh, that's right, believers don't have any, and this is why a lot of them shit on science. Thanks for listening. For Noah's Snark, I'm Atheist Josephina. Until next time, revel in reason and love the logical.